I stand by what I did. I have nothing further to say.
Have you ever wondered what a human face looks like at the exact moment when truth finally crushes the last lie they were holding on to? Not slowly, not gently, but in one brutal instant. That was the look frozen across her features inside that Savannah courtroom. A look that didn't belong to a teenager or a child, but to someone who realized too late that the story she had built around herself was collapsing in front of strangers who could now see her for what she truly was. And that moment, that single moment, is what inspired the title of this video. Because 5 shocking things really did go wrong in that confrontation, but the most disturbing part was watching when reality finally hit her, exactly like the thumbnail says. Her mouth tightened, her eyes widened, and every ounce of practice calm slipped away as if pulled straight off her skin. But this moment didn't come out of nowhere. It was the final crack in a long trail of darkness that began months earlier in a quiet neighborhood where mothers trusted the world to be kind, where danger felt like something that happened far away. Audrey Jordan lived in that world, a world she tried desperately to protect. She had no idea that the threat wasn't lurking in shadows or behind closed doors. It was already inside her home, masked behind teenage charm and the illusion of innocent friendship. Audrey saw the changes first, the strange moods, the late-night messages, the way her daughter began drifting into secrecy. She sensed something unhealthy forming, something she couldn't fully understand but knew she had to stop. And that decision, that act of protection, became the spark that ignited a tragedy Savannah would never forget. As the courtroom watched the girl who caused it all, they weren't expecting the unraveling to happen so suddenly. But moments like this have a way of revealing everything you feared about someone, and everything you never imagined possible. But what exactly pushed her over the edge in that courtroom? What truth struck her so hard that the mask finally shattered? To understand that, we must go back to the day Savannah woke up to a crime that didn't belong in its gentle, old-world streets, and follow the first thread that began to pull her entire world apart. Savannah is the kind of place where people still wave to their neighbors, where porches fill with quiet evening chatter, and where old trees lean over the streets like gentle guardians. It is a city that carries history in its bones, slow afternoons, warm conversations, and a certain softness people cling to in a world that often feels too fast. And maybe that's why the news of Audrey Jordan's death didn't just spread, it ripped through the community. It wasn't just a crime. It was a violation of the very rhythm of the city itself. Audrey wasn't someone who lived on the edge or invited danger into her life. She was the sort of woman people relied on without ever having to ask. She knew everyone's birthday, checked on elderly neighbors, baked for school events, and made sure her daughter felt safe in a world that was growing harsher by the year. Her home was immaculate, her garden well-tended, her routines comforting and familiar. A life built with care, a life that didn't fit the profile of violent tragedy. So when investigators stepped into that home and saw the brutality, when they realized the violence wasn't the kind fueled by desperation or rage but something colder, it created a shockwave. The kind that makes people lock their doors before sunset, the kind that makes parents hold their children a little tighter, the kind that forces a city to confront the terrifying possibility that evil doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it grows quietly in the very places you think are safest. For Savannah's residents, Audrey represented a piece of the city's heart, its softness, its history, its gentle way of life. And losing her in such a violent, personal way felt like losing a part of themselves. Nothing about the crime matched the world they believed they lived in. It was too intimate, too cruel, too deliberate. And as detectives examined the scene, one disturbing truth began to emerge. It wasn't just a murder. It was the result of a deeply twisted relationship that no one saw coming. But who could possibly hate Audrey enough to destroy her world so violently? And how did a seemingly innocent teenage friendship turn into something so sinister? To answer that, we need to look at the unlikely source of the danger, and the first unsettling signs Audrey tried so hard not to ignore. Savannah is a place where time seems to move slower than everywhere else. The cobblestone streets whisper old stories, the Spanish moss drapes like curtains over centuries of memories, and the air carries a gentleness that makes people feel protected simply by belonging there. Parents trust the town's rhythm. Children play beneath oak trees that have stood longer than most homes. It's a city where danger feels like a visitor, someone who comes from far away, stays briefly, and leaves without affecting the fragile peace residents hold so dear. But crimes like Audrey Jordan's murder don't just interrupt that peace, they shatter it in a way that can't be mended. Suddenly, familiar streets looked different, porch lights stayed on longer. Conversations drifted from grocery aisles to neighborhood gatherings, each retelling painted with disbelief. People in Savannah weren't just horrified, they were shaken to the core because the violence felt wrong for their city, like a stain on something pure. The unsettling truth was this: brutality had not arrived from outside town limits. It had grown quietly within, woven through the life of a woman who represented everything the community believed in: kindness, trust, and stability. And it forced Savannah to face a new kind of fear, the fear that evil wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it came disguised as a teenager with a soft voice, polite manners, and a smile that convinced even cautious adults there was nothing to worry about. People who knew Audrey kept asking the same question: how could something like this happen here? But the real question wasn't about geography. It was about the unseen emotional storms brewing in the life of a mother simply trying to protect her child. The more investigators learned, the clearer it became. This was not a random tragedy. It was the final chapter of a dangerous emotional entanglement that had been tightening for months. And while Savannah reeled, unaware of the darker truth still hidden beneath the surface, detectives were about to uncover the first sign that the danger Audrey feared was far closer than anyone imagined. What was this hidden threat that slipped past every instinct, every warning sign, and every mother's intuition? To answer that, we have to step into the beginning of a friendship that should have been harmless, but became deadly instead. It started the way so many teenage friendships do: innocently, quietly, almost invisibly. Audrey never imagined that a simple companionship between her daughter and a 17-year-old girl from a nearby neighborhood would one day lead to the darkest chapter of her life. At first, she welcomed the friendship. She believed in giving her daughter the space to grow, trust, and form bonds. It felt harmless until it didn't. The changes were subtle at first: a shift in tone, a hesitation in answering questions, a new tendency to hide her phone when Audrey walked into the room. Every parent knows the delicate balance between respecting privacy and sensing danger, and Audrey tried desperately not to overreact. But the uneasiness settled into her like a weight she couldn't shake. Tiana Austin was polite, almost too polite. She had a way of speaking that felt rehearsed, a charm that worked on teachers, neighbors, and even Audrey in the beginning. But behind that soft exterior was a possessiveness Audrey couldn't quite name. Her daughter, once cheerful and open, began clinging to this friendship with an intensity that didn't feel healthy. Grades slipped, sleep patterns changed. Emotional distance crept in like a shadow. When Audrey tried gently pulling her daughter back into family routines, she saw the reaction immediately: fear, panic, and something else, something she didn't want to admit, looked like dependence. A dependence no teenager should ever feel toward another. Audrey had seen this kind of influence before, but usually in stories, not in her own living room. An obsessive connection forming not through love, but through control. A kind of emotional gravity that pulled her daughter in deeper every day, and the more Audrey tried to untangle it, the more tangled it became. Inside her heart, a quiet alarm was ringing. Something wasn't right. Something was changing her daughter in ways Audrey couldn't fully understand, and as any protective mother would, she decided she had to act. But what Audrey couldn't know, was that this decision would place her directly in the path of someone who had already rewritten the rules of right and wrong in her mind. What exactly did Audrey do to pull her daughter away? And why did that simple, protective choice trigger a chain reaction that would end in unthinkable violence? To uncover that, we must step into the moment a mother finally said enough. Audrey didn't reach her breaking point with anger. She reached it with fear, the quiet kind that builds slowly when you watch someone you love drifting toward a place you can't follow. For months, she tried gentle conversations, small boundaries, and reminders about school, sleep, and responsibilities. But nothing worked. Her daughter's world was becoming smaller, tighter, wrapped completely around someone whose influence felt more like possession than friendship. And Audrey, who had spent her entire life protecting her child from the dangers of the outside world, realized she was now fighting a danger forming inside her own home. She made the decision that every loving parent eventually faces. She stepped in, not with punishment, not with threats, but with clarity. She told her daughter that the friendship needed space, distance, room to breathe. She explained that not every bond is healthy, not every connection is safe, and not every influence deserves our trust. It wasn't a rejection, it was protection. But to a teenager tangled in emotional dependency, it felt like a betrayal. Her daughter cried, pleaded, begged her to reconsider. The reaction was too intense, too desperate, and it confirmed everything Audrey had been worrying about. Something had wrapped itself around her child's emotions so tightly that even the thought of separation triggered panic. And somewhere else in another house not far away, that same message reached Tiana Austin, except she didn't feel panic. She felt something else, something sharp, something burning, something that transformed a simple parental boundary into a personal attack. Audrey had drawn a line, and Tiana, in her increasingly unstable mind, saw that line as a a challenge, an obstacle she needed to remove. To Audrey, this was just parenting. To Tiana, it was war. From that moment on, the dynamics shifted. What Audrey meant as protection was twisted into something far more dangerous. Tiana's influence didn't weaken. It grew stronger, darker, fed by resentment, and a belief that no one had the right to stand between her and the girl she controlled so completely. And Audrey had no idea that her careful, loving choice had already set something far more sinister in motion. But what exactly changed inside Tiana when she heard about Audrey's decision? And how did a teenager twist a simple no into the beginning of a deadly plan? To understand that, we must step into the mind of a girl whose obsession was about to evolve into violence. For most teenagers, a parent stepping in feels frustrating, maybe unfair, but temporary. They sulk, they argue, and eventually they move on. But Tiana was not like most teenagers. The moment she learned Audrey wanted distance, something shifted inside her with a frightening clarity. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It was a cold, calculated sense of entitlement, the belief that Audrey had no right to interfere in a bond she considered hers to control. To Tiana, Audrey's decision wasn't a protective gesture. It was an attack, a challenge, a violation of the emotional world she had carefully built around Audrey's daughter. This wasn't just friendship to her. It was possession, influence, power. A small kingdom where she alone made the rules. And in her mind, Audrey had just declared herself an enemy of that kingdom. People around her would later describe subtle changes, her stare becoming harder, her voice quieter but sharper, her behavior suddenly unpredictable. She didn't react with the usual teenage defiance. She reacted with strategy. She began positioning herself deeper into the girl's emotions, whispering fears, planting doubts, convincing her that her mother didn't understand her, didn't respect her, didn't want her happy. She carefully rewrote reality, piece by piece. Every protective move Audrey made, every boundary she tried to set, only pushed Tiana further into a mindset of retaliation. She believed she was losing control, and to someone like her, control wasn't just a desire, it was survival. Without it, she felt exposed, powerless, and furious, and this fury didn't explode suddenly, it simmered, quietly, intentionally. Like a thought she returned to again and again until it became familiar, then comfortable, then inevitable. Audrey had unknowingly stepped into a psychological territory. She wasn't prepared for a place where logic didn't matter, and love was seen as interference. And in that distorted lens, Tiana began looking for a solution that didn't involve compromise, only removal. But how does a teenager go from anger to forming a plan? And who helped her turn obsession into something far more dangerous? To uncover that, we need to look at the moment Tiana found someone willing to follow her into the darkness. There is a moment, an invisible line, where anger stops being emotion and becomes intention. For Tiana, that line appeared the second she realized she could not control Audrey. And instead of stepping back, she stepped deeper into her own twisted logic. But even the most disturbed plans rarely begin alone. They need an echo, a second voice, someone who won't challenge the darkness but will quietly feed it. And that is exactly what Tiana found in another teenager already woven into her small circle of influence. This girl wasn't driven by cruelty. She was driven by fear, the kind of fear that grows from living in the orbit of someone unpredictable, intense, and emotionally dominant. To her, Tiana wasn't a friend. She was a leader, a queen, someone you followed not because you believed in her, but because standing against her felt far more dangerous than standing beside her. So when Tiana began speaking about Audrey, at first as a problem, then as an obstacle, then as something that needed to be handled, the other teen didn't walk away. She listened, she nodded. She allowed the conversation to evolve from frustration into threat, and Tiana, seeing no resistance, pushed further. It didn't sound like planning in the beginning. It sounded like venting, exaggerated complaints, dramatic teenage storytelling. But slowly, deliberately, Tiana shaped those conversations into strategy. She talked about Audrey's routines, the layout of the house, the vulnerability of trust. She asked questions not out of curiosity, but to test whether her accomplice would challenge her. The girl didn't. Fear kept her silent, and silence was all Tiana needed, because silence is a kind of permission. And in that permission, the idea hardened. Audrey Jordan didn't need to be convinced. She needed to be removed. What began as resentment grew into a plan spoken in whispers. Two teenagers sitting in a bedroom, discussing logistics they had no emotional maturity to understand, but far too much willingness to execute. It was a moment where innocence ended, and something far darker took its place. But how did those whispered ideas turn into a real, deadly step-by-step plan? And what made these teens believe they could actually carry it out? To see that, we must follow them into the day everything finally crossed from thought to action. Some days begin without warning, without any hint that the world is about to change. But looking back, people often say the same thing. Something felt off. The morning Audrey Jordan woke up on what would unknowingly become her final day carried that kind of quiet unease. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just a heaviness in the air, like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. The Georgia humidity hung thicker than usual, and even the birds outside seemed strangely subdued, as if nature sensed a fracture forming long before the humans did. Audrey spent the morning doing what she always did, straightening the house, preparing lunch, checking in on neighbors, keeping herself busy in the comforting rhythm that defined her life. She didn't know that while she moved through her normal routines, two teenagers were moving through theirs, but with a purpose shaped in darkness. They weren't rushing, they weren't panicking, they were preparing. They had rehearsed this moment so many times in their minds that the plan now felt disturbingly simple to them. Tiana's voice, calm and composed, led the way. She reminded her accomplice of what to say, how to stand, which entrance to use. Their strategy relied on the one thing Audrey still had for them, trust. And trust, when misused, becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. All they needed was a believable reason to step through her door. After that, the rest of the plan would unfold quickly, quietly, deliberately. As the sun climbed higher, the world outside continued on unaware, cars passing, children playing, neighbors chatting. No one could imagine that within a home known for kindness and warmth, a cold calculation was about to ignite. Audrey had felt uneasy for weeks, but she pushed the thought aside. She believed in boundaries, not in paranoia. She believed in guiding her daughter, not fearing her daughter's friends. And that faith, that gentle view of the world, was exactly what made her vulnerable on the day the air felt wrong. But what happened when those teenagers finally walked up to Audrey's door? And how did a simple act of trust become the gateway to unimaginable violence? To see the truth, we must step inside the home, where everything changed in an instant. When Audrey opened her front door that day, she didn't see danger. She saw two familiar teenagers, faces she had welcomed before, kids she had allowed into her daughter's life long before she understood how deep their influence had grown. There was nothing about them in that moment that suggested threat. They weren't frantic. They weren't visibly angry. They wore the same practiced ease teenagers often wear when they're trying to appear innocent. And Audrey, trusting by nature, stepped aside and let them in. What happened next unfolded with a speed and violence so sudden that investigators later struggled to believe it had been carried out by teenagers at all. There were no raised voices, no warning shout, no final argument. It was an ambush, swift, merciless, and coldly intentional. Audrey barely had time to understand what was happening before the attack overwhelmed her. Inside the home she had built with warmth and routine, time didn't just slow down, it froze altogether. Detectives would later note how strangely undisturbed the house looked. No overturned furniture, no signs of a prolonged struggle. It was as if the violence had erupted and ended in the same breath. That lack of chaos made the brutality itself stand out even more. The ligature marks spoke of control, silencing before resistance. The stab wounds, frantic and numerous, spoke of rage, not the rage of impulse, but the rage of someone who had decided long before arriving at the door that Audrey Jordan would not survive the encounter. The contrast was chilling. A pristine living room, carefully arranged family photos, and the unmistakable aftermath of a calculated attack. Investigators would describe the scene as too quiet, too calm, as though the house had absorbed the shock in silence. The same silence Audrey's killers left behind as they walked out, closing the door gently behind them. But the home they left was no longer the same. It had become the epicenter of a crime that would shake Savannah to its core. But who would be the first to step into that silence and realize the unthinkable? And what did detectives see in those early moments that revealed this was no ordinary crime of passion? To uncover that, we must follow the investigator who first crossed Audrey's threshold. Detective Hannah Taylor had seen her share of darkness. Savannah, with all its charm and old-world quiet, still held its buried secrets. Family disputes gone wrong, crimes of desperation, the painful tragedies that sometimes shadowed Southern gentility. But nothing in her long career prepared her for the stillness she felt when she stepped across Audrey Jordan's threshold. It wasn't just the quiet of a crime scene. It was a wrongness, a heaviness that clung to the air like it knew something unspeakable had happened. She paused near the doorway, letting her eyes adjust, letting her instincts catch up to what her mind was already processing. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no panic frozen in the environment. Instead, everything was disturbingly intact, pillows aligned, picture frames straight, furniture untouched. It was a home frozen in routine, one that should have held laughter and movement, not blood and silence. But the moment she saw Audrey, everything about that calm facade fractured. The contrast was jarring. Audrey's injuries told a story that the room refused to reveal, a story of sudden control, explosive violence, and a level of personal rage that didn't match the peaceful surroundings. The ligature marks suggested silencing, the stab wounds suggested fury, and the combination of the two suggested something rare, a killer who planned and lost control, both in the same breath. Detective Taylor crouched down beside the body, letting her practiced detachment take over. But even with years of training, something about the scene unsettled her deeply. It wasn't messy. It wasn't chaotic. It was efficient, swift, purposeful. Not the work of someone panicking or improvising, but someone executing a plan. She moved through the house with quiet steps, studying the small details. No ransacking, no theft, no sign of a break-in. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't random. It was personal. And the more she absorbed, the more one unsettling question took shape in her mind. Who hated a woman like Audrey Jordan enough to kill her this way? But as she continued examining the scene, Detective Taylor noticed something unusual, something in the pattern of violence that hinted at a killer who didn't just act, but needed control. And that single detail would become the first crack, leading her straight to the truth. As Detective Hannah Taylor moved deeper into Audrey's living room, she noticed something that made her stop mid-step, a detail subtle enough to be overlooked, yet bold enough to reshape the entire direction of the case. The violence showed two completely different personalities at play, one cold and deliberate, the other explosive and emotional. In her experience, killers rarely blended both. They were either controlled or chaotic, not both in the same breath. The ligature marks were the first clue. They weren't rushed or sloppy. They were tight, controlled, almost methodical, the kind of restraint meant to silence quickly and efficiently. Whoever applied them knew exactly what they wanted: dominance, control, total submission before the real violence began. That alone suggested planning, someone who had thought through the fear, the resistance, the silence required. But the stab wounds, they told a different story altogether. They were frenzied, repetitive, a storm of emotion. Not a surgical approach, not precision, but the raw eruption of someone who had been boiling from the inside. Someone who didn't just want Audrey gone, they wanted her punished. Detective Taylor stepped back, letting the pattern speak for itself. Two styles, two emotional states, two energies converging on the same victim. Either the same person had flipped between control and chaos, or there were two distinct attackers working together, feeding off each other's emotions. It was that possibility that chilled her the most. Because a coordinated attack from two teenagers would explain the odd blend of order and rage. It would explain the quiet entry, the lack of struggle, the sheer efficiency of the first moment, paired with the overwhelming ferocity that followed. It would also explain why nothing else in the house was touched. They weren't here to steal. They weren't here to argue. They weren't here to threaten. They had one purpose, and they fulfilled it without hesitation. Detective Taylor knew now. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't random. It was intentional, born from a shared commitment to something twisted. But who in Audrey's life carried a hatred this personal? And how did investigators uncover the first clue that pointed squarely toward the two teenagers hidden in her daughter's world? To find out, we need to follow the first neighbor who spoke up and unknowingly cracked the case open. Sometimes the most important clues in an investigation don't come from forensic labs or crime scene diagrams. They come from ordinary people, people who witnessed something they didn't understand at the time, but felt compelled to mention when tragedy struck. And in Audrey Jordan's case, that first breakthrough came from a neighbor who had been watching the subtle shifts in the household long before the murder. She wasn't someone who gossiped. She wasn't someone who judged. She was simply a woman who had lived long enough to recognize when something was off in a family she cared about. When Detective Taylor knocked on her door, she hesitated only for a moment before gently revealing what she had seen over the past few months. The arguments, the emotional distance, the unfamiliar teenager who seemed to appear at the Jordan home more often than felt normal. The neighbor didn't know her name then, but she remembered the intensity in the girl's eyes, an intensity that didn't belong in someone so young. She described it as a look that lingered too long, like she was evaluating everyone around her. The kind of stare that made people instinctively step back. That description alone made Detective Taylor pause. Then came the detail that shifted everything. The neighbor mentioned that Audrey had recently told her she was worried about her daughter's new friendship, that she felt something was changing too fast, too dramatically. Audrey had confided that she planned to step in more firmly, to draw boundaries for her daughter's safety. Hearing that, the detective's instincts sharpened. A troubled friendship, a protective mother. A teenager who suddenly vanished from the home after the crime. These weren't coincidences, they were threads. And when threads repeat themselves in emotional patterns, they usually point toward the truth. Detective Taylor realized something crucial. Audrey wasn't afraid of a stranger. She wasn't worried about the world outside. Her concern had been close, local, personal, and the neighbor had unknowingly confirmed it. The danger had entered through the front door long before the murder happened. But who exactly was this mysterious teenage girl, and what horrifying truth did Audrey's own daughter reveal when investigators finally reached her? To uncover that, we need to step into the most delicate interview of the entire case. Interviewing a grieving child is one of the most delicate moments in any investigation. Detective Hannah Taylor knew that forcing answers would only build walls, not break them. So when Audrey's terrified 12-year-old daughter sat down across from a child psychologist, the approach was gentle, patient, quiet. They didn't ask her for facts, they asked her for feelings. And feelings, when spoken honestly, often reveal truths that evidence cannot. At first, the girl barely spoke above a whisper. She clutched her hands together, her eyes red and distant, the kind of grief too big for someone her age to understand. She didn't know how to process losing her mother, let alone the knowledge that someone she trusted might be involved. But slowly, word by trembling word, she began describing the friendship that had consumed her life. She talked about Tiana not with affection, but with a fearful loyalty that didn't belong between children. She described the constant messages, the need for approval, the way Tiana became upset if she spent time with anyone else, even her own mother. She repeated phrases Tiana had used: "You need me, no one else gets you. We're the only ones who understand each other." It was emotional isolation disguised as friendship, and then came the chilling part. When she told Tiana that Audrey wanted space between them, the girl described how Tiana's expression changed, how her voice went flat, how she whispered something that had kept her awake at night ever since. "I'll fix everything, I promise. No one will come between us again." Those words were spoken softly, but they carried an unmistakable darkness. A vow, a plan, a threat disguised as reassurance. The psychologist exchanged a glance with Detective Taylor, one that silently confirmed what both feared. This wasn't normal teenage attachment. This was control, obsession, the kind that grows in secret until it becomes something far more dangerous. For the first time, investigators had a direct emotional link between Audrey's protective decision and the violence that followed. But how did detectives confront the girl behind this growing shadow? And what did they find when they arrived at Tiana's home at dawn the next morning? To uncover that, we need to witness the arrest that changed everything. The warrant was signed before sunrise. Detective Hannah Taylor didn't want to lose a single hour, because once a violent plan is carried out so cleanly, hesitation becomes a luxury no investigator can afford. As the sky shifted from deep blue to faint gray, police cars rolled quietly toward the modest house where 17-year-old Tiana lived. The neighborhood was different from Audrey's. Fences rusted, paint chipped. A street where life felt heavier, harsher, less protected. But even here, no one expected what was about to unfold. Officers approached the door with a mix of caution and disbelief. They were preparing to arrest a teenager for one of the most violent crimes Savannah had seen in years. When they knocked, the house didn't erupt into chaos. No shouting, no running, no attempt to escape. Instead, Tiana herself opened the door. She stood there barefoot, her hair unbrushed, her expression blank, as if the presence of uniformed officers and detectives meant nothing. There was no fear, no confusion, not even curiosity. Just a quiet, unsettling calm. She looked at them the way someone might look at a late delivery, annoyed at the inconvenience, not concerned about the reason. "Tiana Austin?" an officer asked. She nodded once. The moment the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, something extraordinary happened. Most teens would cry, plead, collapse, or demand answers. But Tiana, she stepped forward without resistance, her posture straight, her breathing steady. Her eyes drifted lazily across the faces around her, studying them the way someone studies puzzle pieces. It was a chilling sight because it wasn't shock, it wasn't guilt, it wasn't even fear, it was indifference. Detective Taylor watched closely, searching for even the smallest hint of remorse or panic, but there was none. Instead, there was a strange flicker in Tiana's expression, something almost like curiosity. As if she wasn't worried about being arrested, she was interested in seeing what would happen next. That was the moment Taylor realized they weren't dealing with a frightened child. They were dealing with someone far more controlled and far more dangerous than anyone expected. But what happened when this unnervingly calm teenager sat across from detectives in the interrogation room? And why did her silence feel more threatening than any confession ever could? To find out, we step into the room where Tiana's true nature finally surfaced. Interrogation rooms have a way of stripping away the personas people build for themselves. Under the humming fluorescent lights, lies crack, bravado crumbles, and even seasoned criminals eventually reveal the truth hiding beneath their fear. But when Tiana Austin sat across from Detective Hannah Taylor, something unexpected happened. Nothing. No tears, no trembling, no questions about her future or her rights. She simply stared. For the first 20 minutes, Detective Taylor spoke calmly, walking through the basics: her name, her age, her understanding of why she was there. Most suspects at least attempt to deny involvement or pretend to misunderstand, but Tiana answered none of it. Her face remained blank, her posture relaxed, her eyes steady. She looked less like someone facing a murder charge and more like someone waiting for entertainment to begin. Taylor had seen this tactic before: silence as control, silence as manipulation. But from a 17-year-old, it was deeply abnormal. Teens typically break under pressure, slip up, or crumble under the fear of consequences. Tiana didn't. Her breathing stayed even, her gaze unbroken. It was as if she refused to acknowledge the gravity of the situation, choosing instead to observe the investigators like curiosities on display. When Taylor finally shifted strategies and placed a single photograph on the table, a smiling picture of Audrey Jordan from Happier Times, something flickered across Tiana's face. Not sadness, not guilt, something far more disturbing: amusement. The corner of her mouth twitched in a smirk so subtle it could have been missed if Taylor hadn't been watching closely. It was the first crack in her silence, and it was enough. Detective Taylor leaned forward, her voice steady. "Tiana, this isn't a game." For the first time, Tiana spoke. "People who get in the way," she said softly, "have to be moved." 7 words, cold, emotionless. Delivered with the chilling simplicity of someone stating a fact, not confessing to a murder. It wasn't just a response. It was a glimpse into a mindset that operated without empathy, without remorse, without hesitation. And it was only the beginning, but what happened next would reveal just how deeply Tiana had planned every moment of Audrey's death. Her silence was terrifying, but her confession would be far, far worse. Once Tiana broke her silence, the interrogation room shifted. The air grew heavier, colder, as if the walls themselves understood what was coming. Detective Taylor had expected tears, anger, denial, some form of emotional release. But instead, Tiana began to speak with the calm, detached precision of someone reading instructions off a page. Her voice remained soft and steady, almost bored, as though she wasn't recounting the destruction of a family, but narrating a routine task she had completed. She described how she and her accomplice planned the attack, not with passion, but with calculation. She spoke about choosing the day, the timing, the method. She explained how easy it was to gain Audrey's trust, how she rehearsed the steps in her head, how she analyzed the quiet moments inside the house to make sure no neighbors were watching. Her words flowed without hesitation, without struggle. It was a confession delivered with the same ease someone might use to explain a school project. But what unsettled the detectives most wasn't the content, it was the tone. There was no remorse, no shame, no emotional conflict, only clarity. When she described Audrey's final moments, she didn't falter. She didn't pause to regain composure. She explained every detail, every decision, as if she were proud of how efficiently she handled things. And the more she spoke, the more obvious it became. Tiana wasn't confessing out of guilt. She was confessing because she wanted them to know how clever she believed she was. At one point, she even leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the detectives, searching their expressions, watching them react. She wanted their discomfort. She wanted the control. It was her last opportunity to dominate the narrative, and she seized it. And then she said something that chilled everyone in the room. "I knew she would never see it coming. People like her never do." Detective Taylor realized in that moment they weren't speaking to someone who lost control. They were speaking to someone who sought it, someone who executed violence not out of impulse, but out of intention. But Tiana wasn't done. After recounting the murder, she moved on to the part she believed made her smartest, the steps she took afterward to erase the evidence. And those details would expose a level of planning no one expected from a teenager. What came next in the interrogation was something even seasoned detectives struggled to process. After walking them through the attack itself, Tiana shifted into a different mode, one that felt disturbingly analytical, almost academic. She began reviewing her own crime the way a student might evaluate a project, pointing out what she thought she did well, what she could have improved, and what she considered a smart choice. The room grew colder with every word. She explained how she wiped surfaces, what she touched, what she avoided touching. She spoke casually about cleaning agents, how to reduce trace evidence, and why certain items in Audrey's home were ideal for minimizing noise. She even discussed timing, how long she believed neighbors would remain indoors, how school schedules influenced her plan, how quickly she could finish before anyone noticed movement outside. And then, with a calmness that made the detective's stomachs twist, she added, "I should have used a different cleaner. The smell is a giveaway unless the place airs out for a long time." It wasn't a confession, it was a critique. There was no fear in her voice, no trembling, no hesitation. She described the planning with the same detachment someone might use discussing a recipe. It was methodical, clinical, and deeply unnatural for a 17-year-old. She even mentioned small mistakes she had made, moments she wished she'd executed more smoothly, not because she regretted them, but because they weren't up to the standard she expected of herself. She sighed at those details, not from guilt, but from disappointment in her own technique. Watching her speak, Detective Taylor understood the depth of the danger. This wasn't just a teenager lost in her emotions. This was someone who viewed murder as a task to perfect, a challenge she had assigned herself, and the interrogation room as a stage where she could perform her cleverness. Every word stripped away any narrative of impulse or youthful confusion. The motive wasn't panic or fear, it was ego, and the more she talked, the clearer it became that she wanted her audience, the detectives, to recognize her skill. But Tiana's chilling analysis wasn't the most shocking part. What investigators uncovered next, a digital trail she thought she had erased, would reveal the full extent of her planning and destroy her chance of ever claiming innocence. After Tiana's confession was recorded, the case should have moved cleanly into trial. The evidence was overwhelming, the timeline airtight, and her own words were enough to bury any reasonable doubt. But Tiana wasn't finished playing. If anything, being arrested opened a new stage for her, a bigger audience, a bigger challenge, a bigger opportunity to manipulate, and the courtroom was the perfect arena. Her first stunt appeared at a crucial pre-trial hearing. She arrived not walking, not steady and confident like the day of her arrest, but slumped in a wheelchair. A blanket draped over her legs, her head tilted as though too weak to hold up, a vacant, unfocused stare replacing the cold alertness detectives had seen before. It was a theatrical transformation, executed with precision. Gasps whispered through the courtroom. Some saw a fragile girl broken by guilt or trauma. Others saw exactly what Detective Taylor saw, performance. Her attorney claimed she was deteriorating mentally and physically, that the stress of confinement had triggered a break severe enough to call her confession into question. He hinted at instability, at confusion, at a compromised mind unable to understand consequences. But the one person not convinced was Tiana herself. Every so often, when she thought no one was watching, her eyes sharpened, her posture straightened, a faint smirk tugged at her lips. She wasn't falling apart, she was observing her effect on the room, measuring reactions, calculating. Prosecutors weren't fooled. They requested an immediate psychological and medical evaluation. No delays, no excuses. If Tiana wanted to play sick, she'd have to play sick for a trained forensic psychiatrist too. What happened next unraveled her entire act. The court-appointed doctor observed her off camera, walking normally, talking clearly, showing none of the symptoms she displayed in the courtroom. His report shattered her performance within 48 hours. No medical or psychological condition present, symptoms consistent with malingering, exposed, yet even being caught didn't embarrass Tiana. If anything, she seemed amused, as if this failed attempt was simply one round in a longer game. But this was only the beginning. Once the trial officially started, Tiana's manipulations grew bolder, and the battle over whether she'd be tried as a child or a predator would change everything. With the wheelchair stunt exposed, most defendants would have stopped. Shame, fear of backlash, or simple exhaustion would have forced them to retreat. But Tiana Austin was not like most defendants. Being caught didn't discourage her, it energized her. She had tested the system, pushed it, manipulated it, and even though the attempt failed, it showed her something important. The courtroom was full of people she could still control emotionally, and she intended to keep doing exactly that. From that moment forward, every appearance she made became part of a performance. She weaponized weakness, flipping between frailty and arrogance with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to unsettle those watching. Some days she sat motionless, eyes lowered, hands trembling slightly, as though she were a frightened child lost in a world too harsh for her. Other days she walked into the courtroom with calm shoulders and a steady stare, as if daring anyone to challenge her version of events. Her behavior wasn't random, it was strategic. She filed complaint after complaint, from the food she was served in custody to the thinness of her blanket to the unfair tone of her arresting officers. None of it had legal weight, none of it changed the mountain of evidence against her. But every motion, every complaint, siphoned time and attention from the court, forcing everyone to dance to her rhythm. It wasn't about winning legally, it was about winning psychologically. Her own attorney struggled desperately to control her. She rolled her eyes at him in open court, whispered criticisms into his ear, even smirked while he argued for her. To her, he wasn't an ally, he was a prop. Someone to make her look vulnerable when she wanted sympathy, or misunderstood when she wanted pity. Meanwhile, Audrey's family endured every show, sitting silently in the gallery as the girl who murdered their loved one turned the justice system into her personal theater. Each stunt chipped away at their patience, their strength, their hope that the process would move swiftly. But there was one tactic left, one final strategy that would determine everything about how the trial would proceed. Because next came the courtroom battle that would decide her fate entirely. Would Tiana be judged as a troubled child, or exposed as the calculating predator she truly was? The first official day of trial didn't start with witness testimony or forensic evidence. It began with a single defining question, one that would shape everything that followed. Should Tiana Austin be tried as a juvenile or as an adult? It was a battle that split the courtroom in two. Her defense attorney painted her as a broken child, fragile, traumatized, shaped by years of instability. He spoke about her young age, the mistakes of adolescence, the potential for rehabilitation. He argued that she wasn't mature enough to grasp the weight of her decisions, that her mind was still forming, still searching for identity, still too young to be branded a monster forever. He emphasized every moment of hardship, every wound from her past, trying to bend the jury's perception into sympathy. And for a moment, some in the room almost felt it, the tragedy of a child lost in circumstances she never chose. But then the prosecution rose. Penelope Clark, calm and composed, walked forward with the kind of steady confidence that made everyone straighten in their seats. Her voice didn't rise, she didn't dramatize. She simply laid out the facts, cold, direct, irrefutable. This crime, she began, was not committed by a child who acted without thinking. It was committed by someone who planned, someone who researched, someone who executed, and someone who felt no remorse. She described the meticulous preparation, the manipulation of the accomplice, the ambush, the cleanup, and the chilling confession. She explained that childhood offers protections because children lack foresight, but Tiana had demonstrated foresight, strategy, and emotional coldness that surpassed even many adult offenders. And then she delivered the line that cut through every argument the defense tried to build. Childhood ends where premeditation begins. The room fell utterly silent. Even the judge paused, absorbing the weight of what had been said. After a tense deliberation, he issued his ruling. Tiana Austin would be tried as an adult. Audrey's family exhaled, a small victory in a sea of grief. Tiana didn't flinch. If anything, her eyes gleamed with something unsettling, as though she welcomed the challenge. But now that the trial was officially underway, the prosecution prepared to reveal the evidence that would expose every dark step she took before the murder, including the digital footprints she believed she had erased forever. When the trial officially opened, the courtroom was filled wall to wall, reporters leaning forward, citizens holding their breath, and Audrey's family sitting in a painful, dignified silence. The stakes weren't just legal anymore. They were emotional, spiritual, communal. Savannah wanted answers, and justice, and closure. The defense stood first. Tiana's lawyer approached the jury with slow, deliberate steps, painting a portrait of a damaged girl shaped by abandonment, instability, and emotional wounds she never healed from. He argued that Tiana's mind was fractured long before Audrey Jordan ever entered her life. He portrayed her as a child lost in the world, clinging desperately to the only relationship she believed gave her worth. Trauma, he emphasized, creates irrational fear. It distorts judgment. It blinds young minds to the consequences of their actions. He asked the jury to see not a killer, but a victim, a girl drowning in her own unhealed wounds. Then the prosecution rose, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. Penelope Clark didn't pace or raise her voice. She simply stood before the jury with a stillness that commanded respect. And when she spoke, the entire room leaned in. She detailed Audrey Jordan's final day, her kindness, her vulnerability, her attempt to protect her daughter. She described the methodical steps Tiana took, the rehearsed manipulation, the ambush, the violence, and the cold aftermath. And then she asked a question that settled over the courtroom like a tightening rope. Does trauma excuse premeditation? Does pain justify planning a murder? Her voice sharpened, not in anger but in clarity. She didn't act out of confusion. She acted out of calculation. Clark described Tiana's confession not as an emotional release, but as a performance designed to demonstrate superiority. She highlighted Tiana's lack of remorse, her courtroom antics, her manipulation of her accomplice. And as she spoke, the jury saw a different image emerge, not a scared child, but someone who sought control with chilling determination. Two stories, two versions of the same girl, one rooted in empathy, one rooted in truth, and now the evidence would decide which version would stand. But the real blow to the defense was coming next, because the digital trail recovered from Tiana's devices would reveal the cold, step-by-step blueprint of a murder she thought she could hide. When the prosecution called the digital forensics expert to the stand, the entire courtroom seemed to shift forward as one. Everyone knew technology leaves a trail, one far harder to erase than fingerprints or footprints. And in Tiana's case, that trail was not just incriminating, it was devastating. The expert explained calmly how he recovered deleted data from Tiana's laptop and phone, fragments of searches, hidden files, wiped browsing history. At first, the jury saw harmless terms, school topics, music, everyday teenage interests. But then the screen changed, and the tone in the courtroom collapsed into stunned silence. The search terms that appeared next didn't belong to a frightened child or a confused teenager. They belonged to someone preparing for violence. Searches like how to silence someone quickly, how to break in without leaving marks, cleaning blood the right way, does bleach remove DNA completely, and chillingly, how long until someone dies from certain wounds. The expert linked each search to a date and time. The pattern was unmistakable. These weren't random curiosities. They were steps, carefully researched, strategically spaced, each one building toward the day Audrey Jordan died. The most horrifying moment came when he revealed searches made just hours before the murder: how to keep someone quiet, how to make sure they can't fight back, what to do if someone sees you. Not one search reflected panic. Not one reflected hesitation, only purpose. Tiana sat motionless as her digital life was exposed. No shame, no embarrassment, not even discomfort. She looked at the list with the same blank calm she had shown during interrogation. To her, these were facts. To the jury, they were proof of a mind preparing for a deliberate, merciless act. The defense tried to argue that teenagers often search strange things out of curiosity or after watching crime shows. But the timeline destroyed that excuse. The searches aligned too closely with the murder, too specifically, too intentionally. This wasn't curiosity, it was preparation, but the prosecution wasn't finished. Next came the part of the digital evidence that truly sealed Tiana's fate, the blueprint of the murder itself, hidden inside timestamps she thought she erased forever. The search history alone had shaken the courtroom, but what came next was even more damning: a precise timeline reconstructed from hidden digital fragments, showing not just what Tiana searched, but when, why, and how those searches matched her actions in real life. It was the kind of evidence no manipulation, no tears, no courtroom performance could erase. The forensics expert brought up a second chart, one that connected Tiana's online activity to the days leading up to the murder. The timestamps created a chilling roadmap: searches for lockpicking after Audrey limited her access to the house, searches for restraining methods right after Audrey told her daughter the friendship needed space, searches about muffling screams only 48 hours before the attack, searches about breaking a hyoid bone made the very night before Audrey was killed. Each digital footprint created a thread. And when all the threads were woven together, they didn't form confusion or panic, they formed a plan. The prosecutor walked the jury step by step through the timeline. Here is where she became angry. Here is where she strategized. Here is where she rehearsed the attack mentally. And here is the moment she finalized what she would do to Audrey Jordan. The courtroom was silent, except for the clicking of the projector and the expert's calm voice. Some jurors flinched at certain details. Others looked away. It wasn't the gore that disturbed them. It was the coldness, the precision, the realization that this murder didn't grow from a moment of rage. It matured slowly, intentionally, through repeated digital searches that revealed a mind sharpening itself for violence. And then came the final blow. Tiana had attempted to wipe her devices clean just 2 hours after Audrey's death. She downloaded a cleaning program, attempted to delete logs, erased her browser history, believing she had outsmarted investigators. But digital footprints are stubborn, and arrogance leaves its own kind of trace. The expert explained that the attempt to delete data was the ultimate proof of consciousness of guilt. She didn't panic and run. She sat down at a computer and tried to erase her blueprint. But even this mountain of evidence wasn't the most shocking moment of the trial. Because next, the defense tried one final tactic: bringing in a psychological expert who claimed trauma shaped Tiana's mind, only for their entire argument to collapse under the prosecutor's cross-examination. With the digital evidence destroying any hope of claiming innocence, the defense shifted to the only strategy they had left: explaining Tiana's actions instead of denying them. Their goal wasn't to prove she didn't do it. Their goal was to convince the jury why she did it, and hope that why might soften the blow of the punishment. So they brought in a psychological expert, highly educated, well-spoken, someone who could stand before the jury and paint a picture of Tiana's mind as something tragically shaped, not deliberately twisted. He spoke gently, compassionately, describing childhood neglect, emotional instability, and years of abandonment that left her desperate for attachment. He explained how trauma could distort reality, warp judgment, and make a teenager cling to relationships with frightening intensity. He described Tiana as a wounded child seeking control in a world that had taken control from her too many times. A tragic figure, a product of circumstance, not a villain, just broken. For a moment, the courtroom felt divided. Even some jurors shifted uncomfortably. After all, who hasn't heard stories of young lives shaped by hardship? Who hasn't wondered how trauma can darken a path before a child ever learns right from wrong? But then came the cross-examination. Prosecutor Penelope Clark approached slowly, holding no notes, just a stillness that made the expert straighten in his seat. Her first question was simple. "Doctor, does trauma erase the ability to plan?" He hesitated. "No, but it can influence," she cut in softly. "Does trauma eliminate someone's awareness that murder is wrong?" Another pause. "No." Then she began listing the evidence. The searches, the planning, the cleanup, the manipulation, the wheelchair stunt, the chilling smirk during interrogation. "Doctor," she said, leaning in, "does trauma normally produce this level of strategy, control, and emotional detachment?" He shifted. "Not typically," she pressed further, listing the clinical traits of psychopathy one by one: lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, grandiosity, calculated planning. With each trait, she tied it directly to Tiana's actions. And with each step, the expert was forced to agree. Finally, she asked the question that shattered the defense entirely. "Would you agree that, regardless of her trauma, the defendant's behavior is highly consistent with psychopathy?" Silence. A long, heavy silence, and then the expert, the defense's own witness, answered, "Yes." The courtroom reacted in a ripple of stunned breaths, but the next witness would take the trial from shocking to unforgettable, because Audrey's own words, written before her death, were about to return to the courtroom and break it wide open. Just when the courtroom believed it had heard the worst, when the digital evidence, the confession, and the psychological revelations had already painted a devastating picture, the prosecution brought forward something no one expected. A spiral-bound journal belonging to Audrey Jordan, a quiet, personal artifact, a place she wrote dreams, reminders, and sometimes letters to her future self. The judge allowed a single entry to be read aloud. Penelope Clark approached the stand with careful steps, holding the journal as though it were something fragile, almost sacred. When she began reading, her voice softened, not theatrical, not dramatic, just honest. And those simple, hopeful words poured through the courtroom like a wave no one was prepared for. "Dear future me," the letter began, "I hope by the time you read this, our daughter is thriving. I hope we figured out the teenage years together." Audrey wrote about wanting to travel someday, maybe to Italy, maybe somewhere quiet by the ocean. She wrote about planting a lemon tree in the backyard, about her goal to run a half marathon, about the pride she felt watching her daughter grow. She wrote about mornings filled with gratitude, evenings filled with peace, and a future she fully believed she'd live to see. There was no mention of danger, no hint of fear, no sense her life was drawing near its end, just hope. Just love, just a mother planning the life she expected to continue building. The jurors' faces tightened, some wiped tears. Even the courtroom officers shifted uncomfortably, as though trying to hide the emotion rising inside them. Because Audrey's letter didn't just remind them she was gone, it reminded them what had been stolen, a future filled with ordinary, beautiful moments she would never have again. And through all of it, Tiana didn't shed a tear. She stared ahead, expression unchanged, as if the words of the woman she killed meant nothing. The reading ended with Audrey's final line, "Life is so fragile. I hope I never forget to cherish it." The silence that followed was heavier than any evidence presented so far. Audrey's voice, soft, hopeful, full of life, had become the most powerful testimony of the entire trial, but the emotional devastation wasn't over. The next witness would reveal a truth so twisted, so unexpected, that it would redefine the entire motive behind Audrey's murder and expose a darkness even deeper than anyone imagined. Everyone believed they understood the motive by this point. An obsessive friendship, a controlling teenager, a mother standing in the way. It was horrifying, but it made sense, at least on the surface. But when the prosecution called their final rebuttal witness, a quiet 16-year-old girl who once circled Tiana's orbit, the courtroom's understanding of the case ruptured completely. She walked to the stand with trembling hands, avoiding Tiana's gaze. Her voice quivered at first, but when she glanced at Audrey's grieving family, something in her steadied. She began describing the private world Tiana created, a world hidden from teachers, parents, even close friends. It was a world made of rules, challenges, and twisted expectations. A world where loyalty wasn't earned, it was demanded. And then the truth came out. This murder wasn't driven solely by jealousy, or fear, or even obsession. It was a game. A sick, escalating series of tests Tiana imposed on the small group of teens who orbited around her. What started as petty vandalism and small dares grew darker, acts designed to prove loyalty, to show who was strong enough to stay in Tiana's inner circle. The witness described the final challenge, the one that made her walk away in terror. Tiana presented Audrey Jordan not as a person, not even as an obstacle, but as the ultimate test, a target. A pawn in a twisted competition meant to prove devotion and fearlessness. She said, the witness whispered, voice cracking, if someone really loves you, they'll do anything for you, even remove the people who get in the way. The courtroom froze. This wasn't a murder rooted in normal teenage emotion. This was a performance, a competition, a display of dominance for an audience of frightened followers. The witness explained that one teen refused, another resisted. But Tiana had pulled the weakest one close, manipulating her until fear of being cast out, fear of becoming the next target, made her compliant. And in that horrifying context, Audrey's death became something even more chilling. The final round of a game she never knew she was part of. Tiana stared at the witness with pure hatred, no guilt, no remorse, only rage at being exposed. But the trial wasn't finished yet. Because before the verdict came down, the jury and the entire courtroom would witness a moment so shocking, so explosive, that it would reveal the real Tiana more clearly than any evidence ever could. The jury deliberated for less than an hour, an astonishingly short time for a case so emotionally charged. But after weeks of testimony, tears, revelations, and a motive more twisted than anyone expected, the jurors didn't need long. The evidence wasn't just strong, it was overwhelming. And the truth about Tiana had been revealed in layers, calculated, chilling, undeniable. When the courtroom doors opened and the jury filed back in, the air felt heavier than ever. Audrey's family clasped hands, bracing themselves. Reporters leaned forward. Even the judge seemed to sit straighter, sensing the gravity of the moment. Tiana walked in without handcuffs, escorted by deputies. Her posture was perfect, shoulders back, chin slightly lifted, expression unreadable. To anyone who didn't know better, she looked like someone arriving to collect a prize rather than a verdict. There was no fear, no humility. Just that same cold composure she'd carried since the day of her arrest. The foreperson stood. We find the defendant guilty on all counts. The words echoed against the walls, carrying the weight of every moment Audrey Jordan would never get to live. A soft gasp rippled through the room. Audrey's daughter clung to her grandmother, crying quietly. Her husband lowered his head into his hands. The prosecutors exhaled with visible relief. Everyone reacted except Tiana. She didn't blink. She didn't shift. She didn't show even a flicker of human emotion. Instead, she nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if the verdict aligned with some private expectation she'd already accepted. It was as though guilt was an inconvenience, not a consequence. But then something changed. When she glanced toward the jury, toward the people who had seen through her performance, her manipulation, her theatrics, her mask slipped for the first time. Her eyes narrowed, lips tightening in a subtle but unmistakable expression of contempt. A silent message. You didn't beat me. You just played your part. That single look sent a chill through the room. It was the first glimpse of the true Tiana, unfiltered, unmasked, unrestrained. And the most terrifying part, this moment was nothing compared to what she was about to do next. Because the sentencing hearing would become the scene no one could ever forget, a moment where Tiana's carefully controlled facade shattered completely, and she unleashed a final, desperate act of violence right inside the courtroom. By the time sentencing day arrived, Savannah felt like it had been holding its breath for months. The courtroom was packed once again, families, reporters, citizens, all waiting to witness the final chapter of a tragedy that had reshaped their community. Audrey's family sat in silent sorrow, bracing for the moment when the law would decide the fate of the girl who had destroyed their world. Tiana was brought into the courtroom without her usual composure. This time her expression wasn't blank or indifferent. It was simmering, a tightness in her jaw, a flicker of irritation in her eyes. She sensed the end approaching, and for someone like her, an ending meant losing control. That alone was enough to ignite something volatile inside her. The judge, stern and measured, offered her one final chance to speak. Her attorney whispered urgently, begging her to stay silent. But Tiana lifted her chin, ignored him completely, and stepped forward. What she delivered wasn't an apology. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't even an attempt at justification. It was a taunt. She spoke coldly about people who overreact to consequences and how weak-minded adults misunderstand strong-willed youth. Her voice carried a bitter mix of arrogance and contempt. Then she glanced directly at Audrey's grieving husband, holding his daughter close, and allowed the smallest, most chilling smirk to curve across her lips. Gasps filled the room. Even the judge, a man known for his unshakable composure, visibly stiffened. His voice hardened as he delivered a blistering condemnation, calling her manipulative, dangerous, and utterly devoid of empathy. He spoke of Audrey's stolen future, her shattered family, and the profound cruelty behind the crime. Then came the sentence, life in prison, no possibility of parole. A silence fell, heavy and absolute, and that's when the mask broke. Tiana's posture collapsed into sudden, uncontrolled fury. She lunged forward, screaming incoherently, her voice no longer calculated but wild, primal, unhinged. Deputies rushed in as she kicked, fought, and thrashed, trying desperately to break free. It took 4 officers to restrain her, 4 grown adults to contain a teenager consumed by pure rage. As they dragged her out of the courtroom, her screams echoing down the hallway, everyone saw the truth. Her calm had always been an act. Her control had always been a lie, and beneath the mask was chaos. But even after her explosive meltdown, one final moment remained, a quiet reflection on the aftermath, and how the city of Savannah would carry the weight of this case long after the courtroom went silent. After Tiana was dragged screaming from the courtroom, the silence that followed felt heavier than any chaos she created. It wasn't relief, not really. It was something more complicated, something deeper. The people inside that room weren't just witnessing the end of a trial, they were witnessing the end of innocence for an entire community. Savannah had always believed in its quiet beauty, its gentleness, its sense of safety. But this case forced the city to confront something darker, that evil doesn't always arrive as a shadow in the night. Sometimes it walks through the front door smiling. Audrey's family sat together long after the judge left the bench. Her mother held her granddaughter close, whispering soft reassurances that could never erase the pain, but offered a thread of comfort amid the heartbreak. Her husband stayed still, tears slipping silently down his face, a man whose life had been split into 2 realities. The world before Audrey's death and the world after. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, replaying the moment the verdict was read, the explosion of rage from Tiana, and the unbearable image of a teenager so consumed by darkness she no longer resembled anything human. It shook them, it made them look at their own families, their own children, their own assumptions about danger. The case had become more than a crime, it was a mirror showing them how fragile the safety they believed in truly was. For Detective Hannah Taylor, the case would follow her long after the file was closed. She had seen many tragedies, but something about this one clung to her, the contrast between Audrey's kindness and the senseless brutality of her death, the cold calculation of a girl who should have been learning how to build a future rather than destroying one. It reminded her how unpredictable human behavior can be, how some storms form quietly in the people we least expect. Savannah mourned for months. Memorial services filled parks and churches. Candles flickered on porches. And everywhere people carried the same unspoken thought. How could something so cruel happen here? And yet, despite the sorrow, the community held onto Audrey's memory, not defined by how she died, but by how she lived. Gentle, hopeful, fiercely loving. But before we close this story, there's still one last question to explore, one final reflection on the legacy of this case, the lessons it left behind, and the quiet reminder it carries for every parent, every community, every heart that has ever trusted the world to be safe. In the weeks after the sentencing, life in Savannah slowly resumed its rhythm, but the echo of this case remained tucked into every quiet moment. It lingered on front porches during evening conversations, in the hushed prayers whispered inside churches, and in the protective arms of parents who held their children just a little longer than before. Audrey Jordan's story had become part of the city's memory, not a headline, not a scandal, but a reminder of how fragile one life can be and how deeply its loss can reverberate. People didn't speak of Tiana Austin as the teen killer anymore. They spoke of her as a symbol of something that frightened them more deeply, a reminder that evil doesn't always wear the face we expect. It doesn't always come from hardened criminals or violent strangers. Sometimes it grows quietly in the shadows of loneliness and unresolved pain, blooming into something monstrous before anyone realizes the danger. Audrey's family chose not to be defined by the violence that took her. They honored her by continuing her traditions, planting flowers in the garden she loved, supporting community programs, spreading the kindness she lived every day. Her daughters, surrounded by love and patience, began the long, painful journey of healing, learning that her mother's final act wasn't a goodbye, it was protection. For Detective Hannah Taylor, the case became one she would carry throughout her career. Not because of its brutality, but because of its lesson, that sometimes the darkest storms form in the minds of those we never suspect, and that the smallest warning signs, the gut feelings, the subtle shifts, the quiet troubles, should never be ignored. In the end, Savannah didn't lose its gentleness. It didn't lose its spirit. If anything, it grew stronger, more aware, more connected. Audrey Jordan's name became a promise to listen more closely, to protect more fiercely, and to remember that the line between safety and danger can be thinner than we ever imagine. And as this chapter closes, one truth remains. Evil may try to hide behind innocence, but truth always finds its way to the surface. But Audrey's case is not the only one where tragedy brewed quietly behind familiar faces. In our next story, we uncover another case where danger slipped in unnoticed until it was far too late to stop. Are you ready for what comes next?